On a crisp autumn evening, Riverton's elite gathered at Thornfield Estate for what was advertised as an intimate dinner party. Instead, they became witnesses to a tragedy that would expose the dark underbelly of wealth and privilege. An 18-year-old bride, a possessive 75-year-old husband, and a French chef caught in their deadly dance of control and desperate love. The centerpiece of the evening was to be a special chocolate soufflé, a dish that carried both poison and salvation in its delicate folds. As the young Mrs. Bishop raised her spoon to take that fatal bite, 3 words scratched hastily on a napkin would shatter the evening's carefully orchestrated performance. "Don't eat it." What followed was a confrontation that left one dead, one imprisoned, and one vanished into the night, leaving behind a legacy that would force an entire community to question the true price of gilded cages and the desperate lengths to which love and control can drive the human heart. The wrought iron gates of Thornfield Estate parted silently, their elaborate scrollwork casting long shadows in the late afternoon sun. The black Mercedes glided up the curved driveway, gravel crunching beneath its tires as it approached the imposing Victorian mansion. In the backseat, the teenage bride clutched her small handbag, her knuckles white with tension as she took in her new home for the first time. The property sprawled across 40 acres of meticulously maintained grounds, a testament to old money and older traditions. Gothic spires reached toward the clouding sky, while manicured hedges lined the path like silent sentinels. The house itself loomed before them, its weathered stone facade and towering windows offering no warmth despite the well-maintained grandeur. The newly married Mrs. Bishop watched her reflection in the bulletproof glass as the car came to a stop. At 18, her youth was stark against the backdrop of such aged opulence. Her wedding ring, a heavy antique piece that had belonged to her husband's grandmother, felt foreign on her finger. The weight of it seemed to pull her down, much like the reality of her situation. "Welcome home, my dear," Maxwell Bishop said, his liver-spotted hand covering hers. At 75, he moved with the deliberate grace of someone accustomed to power. His steel-gray eyes, still sharp despite his years, watched her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. She forced a smile, remembering her family's debts, the promises of education and opportunity that had led to this moment. The household staff waited in perfect formation on the grand steps, a tableau of efficiency and discipline that spoke volumes about their employer. The head housekeeper, Mrs. Reynolds, stood at attention, her steel-gray hair pulled into a severe bun that matched her expression. Behind her, a row of maids in pressed black uniforms, their faces carefully neutral as they watched their new mistress emerge from the car. Mrs. Bishop, Mrs. Reynolds stepped forward, her voice clipped and formal. "We are honored to welcome you to Thornfield Estate. The staff has been thoroughly briefed on your preferences and schedules." The word schedules caught the bride's attention. She hadn't been aware she had any yet. Maxwell's hand pressed against her lower back, guiding her up the steps with a possessiveness that didn't escape the staff's notice. As they passed through the heavy oak doors, the teenage bride caught a glimpse of movement in her peripheral vision. A man in chef's whites, watching from a side entrance before disappearing into the shadows of the house. The grand foyer opened before them like the maw of some great beast. A crystal chandelier cast rainbow prisms across marble floors, while oil paintings of stern-faced bishops watched from gilded frames. Maxwell guided her through a practice tour, his voice taking on the tone of a museum curator as he detailed the history of each room, each artifact, each expectation. "The East Wing will be yours, my dear," he said, leading her down a corridor lined with surveillance cameras. "I've had it completely renovated to suit a young woman's needs. Your routine will be simple enough to follow: breakfast at 7, lunch at noon, afternoon tea at 4, and dinner promptly at 7. Mrs. Reynolds will assist you in maintaining the schedule." The bride's quarters were a study in golden opulence, French provincial furniture, silk drapes, and a 4-poster bed that dominated the space. Everything selected with care, everything speaking of wealth and taste, yet nothing reflecting the teenage girl who would inhabit it. A tablet rested on the bedside table, its screen displaying a detailed daily schedule. "Your wardrobe has been fully stocked," Maxwell continued, opening double doors to reveal a closet larger than her old bedroom. Rows of designer clothes, all in her size, all selected without her input, hung in color-coded sections. I took the liberty of having our personal shopper select appropriate attire for every occasion. You'll find everything labeled and organized by event type. The tour continued through the house, each room revealing new layers of control masked as luxury. The library, filled with leather-bound classics but requiring permission to access. The conservatory, a glass-enclosed paradise she could visit only during designated hours. The music room, where she would be expected to practice piano under the watchful eye of an instructor 3 times a week. It was in the kitchen where she first saw him clearly, the chef. He stood at a massive industrial range, his focus entirely on the copper pots before him. Unlike the other staff, he didn't immediately snap to attention at Maxwell's entrance. Instead, he finished his task with practiced precision before turning to acknowledge them. "This is Andre Laurent, our executive chef," Maxwell introduced, a hint of pride coloring his voice. He trained at Le Cordon Bleu and has worked in some of the finest establishments in Europe. He'll be preparing all our meals according to the nutritionist's guidelines. Andre nodded politely, his dark eyes meeting the bride's for just a moment. At 32, he cut a striking figure in his crisp whites, a quiet confidence in his movements that spoke of mastery rather than subservience. "Madam," he said simply, his French accent subtle but present. Something in his gaze suggested understanding, perhaps even sympathy, before he returned to his work. "Dinner will be served promptly at 7, Maxwell reminded them all, though his attention remained fixed on his young wife. "I expect everyone to be properly dressed and prepared. No exceptions." The first dinner at Thornfield Estate set the tone for all that would follow. The massive dining room, with its Corford ceiling and crystal chandelier, felt more like a stage than a space for family meals. Maxwell sat at the head of the 14-foot mahogany table, his new bride to his right, empty chairs stretching out before them like an audience to their performance. Andre served each course himself, his movements elegant and efficient. The meal was exquisite, a delicate soup of summer squash, perfectly seared duck breast, and a chocolate soufflé that would have impressed the harshest critic. Yet every bite was overshadowed by Maxwell's running commentary on proper etiquette, posture, and conversation topics. "A lady never discusses politics at dinner," he corrected when she attempted to mention the recent local elections. "And do try to hold your fork properly, my dear. Mrs. Reynolds will arrange for additional etiquette lessons starting tomorrow." The security measures became apparent as the evening wore on. Cameras tracked movement through every corridor, their red lights blinking like mechanical eyes. Key cards were required for most doors, with access levels clearly defined and monitored. The grounds, despite their beauty, were surrounded by state-of-the-art fencing, invisible but present. "It's all for your safety, of course," Maxwell explained as he showed her the security office, where banks of monitors displayed every angle of their golden prison. "The world can be dangerous for a young woman of your new position. I've taken every precaution to ensure you're protected." That night, alone in her opulent bedroom, the teenage bride stood at the window, watching shadows play across the immaculate grounds. The moon cast an ethereal glow over the gardens, where fountains danced and statues stood frozen in eternal poses. From somewhere in the house, she could hear the faint sounds of kitchen staff cleaning up, the occasional clink of china and muffled voices the only reminder that she wasn't completely alone in this massive mausoleum. Her phone, monitored and restricted, showed dozens of missed calls from friends she was no longer allowed to contact. Her social media accounts had been deleted for security purposes, her email monitored and filtered. Even her clothes felt like a costume, selected and approved by others to create the image of the perfect young wife. In the distance, she caught a glimpse of movement, Andre, walking through the herb garden with a basket, collecting fresh ingredients for tomorrow's meals. He paused, looking up at her window, and for a moment their eyes met across the darkness. He nodded once, a simple acknowledgement of shared understanding, before disappearing back into the shadows of the estate. Maxwell's voice rang through the intercom system, a feature she hadn't known existed until that moment. "It's time for bed, my dear. Remember, breakfast is served promptly at 7. Sleep well." The lights dimmed automatically, presumably controlled from somewhere else in the house. In the artificial twilight, the teenage bride lay in her new bed, surrounded by silk and luxury, feeling more trapped than she ever had in her family's modest home. The weight of her wedding ring seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment, a golden shackle binding her to this life she'd chosen out of desperation. Tomorrow would bring new lessons, new rules, new expectations. But for now, in the quiet darkness of her first night at Thornfield Estate, she allowed herself one silent tear for the life she'd left behind, and the uncertain future that stretched before her like the long shadows in the moonlit garden below. Days at Thornfield Estate blurred together in a haze of scheduled activities and enforced routines. The young Mrs. Bishop found herself moving through them like a ghost, perfectly dressed and coiffed, yet increasingly hollow inside. Her prescribed schedule left no room for spontaneity or joy. Piano lessons, etiquette training, supervised walks in the garden, all under the watchful eyes of cameras and staff. The breaking point came during a particularly sleepless night, 3 months into her marriage. The massive house creaked and settled around her, its shadows seeming to press in from all sides. Unable to bear the suffocating silence of her gilded cage any longer, she slipped from her bed, bare feet silent on the marble floors. The kitchen lights were on. Through the glass panel in the door, she could see Andre working, his movements precise and graceful as he kneaded dough on the marble counter. The kitchen was his domain during these quiet hours, free from the formal constraints that governed the rest of their carefully orchestrated lives. She hesitated, hand on the door. This wasn't part of her approved schedule. But something about the peaceful scene before her drew her forward like a moth to flame. Andre looked up as she entered, flour dusting his dark hair. For a moment, neither spoke. Then, wordlessly, he reached for another apron and held it out to her. "Cannot sleep, madam." His voice was soft, careful not to break the delicate quiet of the midnight hour. "Perhaps some warm milk with honey." "Please, call me Rose," she whispered, the sound of her own name strange after months of Mrs. Bishop and Madam. She tied the apron with trembling fingers. "What are you making?" "Pain au chocolat. My grandmother's recipe." He gestured to the dough before him. "Would you like to learn?" That first night marked the beginning of a subtle shift in the mansion's carefully maintained order. Rose found herself drawn to the kitchen's warmth, sneaking down whenever sleep eluded her. Andre never seemed surprised to see her, as if he too lay awake anticipating these stolen moments. Under his patient guidance, she learned the secrets of French pastry, the art of sauce making, the joy of creating something with her own hands. He taught her to feel the right consistency of dough, to trust her instincts with seasoning, to find meditation in the rhythmic chopping of vegetables. "My grandmother always said," he told her one night as they shaped croissants side by side, "that cooking is a language of love. Each dish carries memories, emotions, stories." His hands covered hers, showing her how to achieve the perfect lamination. "This is how we remember who we are." Their conversations, whispered over simmering pots and rising dough, revealed the people they were beneath their assigned roles. She learned of his childhood in Lyon, his years of training, the passion that drove him to perfect his craft. He listened as she spoke of her dreams of college, her love of art, the weight of family expectations that had led her to this gilded prison. Maxwell's increasing business trips provided more opportunities for these midnight lessons. The staff, who had watched their young mistress fade like a flower without sunlight, began to notice subtle changes. Color returned to her cheeks. Her smile, though careful, reached her eyes more often. During formal dinners, she would catch Andre's gaze as he served each course, a secret understanding passing between them. Mrs. Reynolds was the first to notice the shift in dynamic. The head housekeeper's sharp eyes missed nothing, including the way Rose lingered in the kitchen during meal planning, how her posture changed when Andre entered a room, the way their fingers sometimes brushed during service. "The kitchen is no place for a lady of your standing," she warned one afternoon, her loyalty to Maxwell evident in every clipped word. "There are more appropriate ways to occupy your time." But the kitchen had become Rose's sanctuary, the one place in the vast estate where she felt truly alive. Andre's presence was like oxygen after months of carefully measured breaths. Their growing intimacy, though never crossing physical boundaries, was sustained through shared glances, brushed fingers, and words loaded with unspoken meaning. During one of Maxwell's extended trips, Andre began teaching Rose his grandmother's special recipes. Dishes passed down through generations, each carrying its own story. As they worked side by side, their shoulders touching occasionally, he would tell her about the women who had created these dishes, their strength, their resilience. "My grandmother," he said one night, demonstrating how to fold herbs into fresh pasta dough. "She survived the war, rebuilt her life through cooking. She taught me that food is more than sustenance. It is survival, it is resistance, it is love." Rose found herself opening up about her own family struggles, the crushing debt that had made Maxwell's proposal seem like salvation. "I thought I was being strong," she confessed, hands covered in flour. "Making a sacrifice for my family. I didn't realize." "Strength takes many forms," Andre replied softly, his hand briefly covering hers. "Sometimes it is in surviving, in finding moments of joy even in darkness." The tension in the household grew as subtle changes rippled through the established order. Staff members exchanged knowing looks when Rose appeared in the kitchen, her prescribed activities forgotten. The gardener reported seeing lights in the kitchen at odd hours. Security footage showed lengthy conversations over meal preparation that seemed to require an unusual amount of discussion. Maxwell, despite his frequent absences, began to sense the shift in his carefully ordered domain. His calls became more frequent, his questions more pointed. "I trust you're maintaining your schedule," he would say, his voice carrying an edge. "Mrs. Reynolds tells me you've been spending a great deal of time in the kitchen." "I'm learning about household management," Rose would reply, the lies becoming easier with practice. "It's important for me to understand all aspects of running the estate." But there were slips, small tells that threatened to unravel their careful pretense. A lingering glance at dinner service, a shared smile over an inside joke, the way Rose's hand trembled slightly when Andre served her favorite dessert, one he had taught her to make during their midnight lessons. The other staff members began taking subtle sides. Some, like young Lucy the maid, would casually mention Maxwell's location in the house, allowing Rose to time her kitchen visits safely. Others, loyal to their employer, watched with disapproving eyes and carefully noted every interaction. One evening, as Rose helped Andre prepare vegetables for the next day's meals, their quiet conversation was interrupted by Mrs. Reynolds' sudden entrance. The housekeeper's eyes took in the scene, their proximity, the casual intimacy of their postures, the flower on Rose's sleeve where Andre's hand had brushed it. "Mr. Bishop will be returning early from his trip," she announced, her gaze sharp and knowing. "Tomorrow evening. He's asked that a special dinner be prepared to celebrate his return." The weight of her words hung in the air long after she left. Rose and Andre stood in silence, the rhythm of their chopping knives carrying an edge of desperation. Both knew that something had shifted, that their precious sanctuary might soon be threatened. "Perhaps," Andre began, his voice carefully controlled. "Perhaps we should review the dinner menu for tomorrow, madam." The formal address felt like a physical blow. Rose nodded, stepping back, rebuilding the walls that their midnight encounters had slowly dismantled. But as she turned to leave, Andre spoke again, so softly she almost missed it. "Remember what I said about strength, Rose? About survival." That night, alone in her opulent bedroom, Rose stood at the window watching the kitchen lights below. Andre was still there, preparing for tomorrow's elaborate dinner. The distance between them seemed both infinite and non-existent. In the morning, everything would return to its careful choreography. She would be Mrs. Bishop again, the perfect young wife in her perfect prison. But for now, in the quiet darkness, she could still feel the warmth of the kitchen, the gentle touch of Andre's hands guiding hers, the taste of freedom in the recipes he had taught her. Tomorrow, Maxwell would return, bringing with him the weight of watchful eyes and rigid expectations. But something had awakened in Rose, something that even the most gilded cage couldn't contain. In learning to create, she had rediscovered herself, and no amount of security cameras or scheduled activities could erase the person she had become in those midnight hours in Andre's kitchen. The sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor made her step back from the window. As she slipped into bed, she could smell the lingering scent of fresh bread on her skin, a reminder of the real life that existed beyond these silk-draped walls. Sleep would not come easily tonight, but tomorrow, Tomorrow would bring its own recipe for survival. Early morning light painted the herb garden in shades of gold as Rose moved between the neatly arranged beds, basket in hand. Her prescribed morning walks had gradually shifted earlier, coinciding with Andre's herb-gathering ritual. Their meetings, though seemingly chance, were orchestrated with the precision of a dance. "The basil is particularly fragrant this morning," Andre said softly, appearing beside her as if conjured by her thoughts. His fingers brushed hers as he demonstrated the proper way to pluck the leaves. "You must handle them gently, like this." Their time in the garden became a silent symphony of shared glances and carefully choreographed movements. Each herb collected told its own story: rosemary for remembrance, thyme for courage, sage for wisdom. The morning dew masked their whispered conversations from the omnipresent surveillance systems. "I dream of a different life," Rose confessed one morning, her voice barely audible above the fountain's gentle splash. "One where I'm not just an ornament in someone's collection." Andre's hand paused over a sprig of lavender. "Dreams can become reality, if one has the courage to pursue them." His dark eyes met hers, conveying meanings deeper than words could safely express. Inside the house, their connection grew through a language of subtle signs and hidden messages. Recipe cards became love letters, ingredients lists transformed into coded conversations. A dog-eared page in Julia Child's cookbook might contain a pressed herb, their private signal for meeting in the garden. A particular spice added to a dish could convey feelings too dangerous to speak aloud. One afternoon, while demonstrating the proper technique for rolling pasta, Andre's hands lingered over Rose's. The kitchen, usually their sanctuary, felt charged with electricity. Their faces drew closer, breaths mingling over the flour-dusted counter. The sudden crash of a dropped tray shattered the moment. Lucy, the young maid, stood in the doorway, her face a mix of shock and something else, understanding, perhaps even sympathy. The broken pieces of china between them seemed to echo the fragility of their situation. "I'll clean that up right away, madam," Lucy said quickly, her eyes darting between them. "And I believe Mrs. Reynolds was looking for you in the library." The warning was clear. Their careful dance had witnesses, some friendly, others not so much. The household staff had begun to divide into factions: those who saw love blooming and chose to protect it, and those whose loyalty to Maxwell remained absolute. Anonymous notes began appearing, warnings slipped under doors, whispered messages passed in hallways. "He knows something's changed. Be careful in the kitchen. The cameras see everything." Andre found himself wrestling with his conscience. His position at Thornfield Estate had been the culmination of years of hard work, a prestigious post that any chef would envy. Yet increasingly, the job felt like complicity in Rose's imprisonment. During sleepless nights, he drafted resignation letters, only to burn them by morning. "I could find work elsewhere," he told Rose during one of their garden meetings. "Perhaps you could too." The hope in his voice was met with fear in her eyes. "He would never let me go," she whispered. "Everything I am belongs to him now." Their caution redoubled, but love, like steam, finds ways to escape even the tightest lid. Staff noticed how Rose's steps seemed lighter, how her smile reached her eyes when Andre entered a room. During formal dinners, their gazes would meet and hold for heartbeats too long to be proper. Maxwell, despite his frequent absences, began to sense the change in his young wife. Her newfound interest in cooking, once dismissed as a harmless hobby, now drew his suspicion. Security footage was reviewed more frequently. Staff questioned about their mistress's daily activities. The installation of additional cameras in the kitchen came without warning. One morning, Andre arrived to find technicians mounting sleek black devices in every corner of his domain. The message was clear: their sanctuary was compromised. Yet even under increased surveillance, they found ways to communicate. Recipes became their secret language. A request for coq au vin might mean, "Meet me in the garden at dawn." A discussion about soufflé techniques could carry declarations of love hidden in technical terms. Mrs. Reynolds watched it all with growing concern, her loyalty to Maxwell warring with her sympathy for the young bride she'd watched wither under his control. "Be careful," she warned Rose one afternoon, her usual severity softened by genuine worry. "Some things, once broken, cannot be mended. The tension in the household reached fever pitch when Maxwell announced an extended stay at the estate. His presence cast a shadow over their carefully constructed world of subtle signals and stolen moments. Meals became exercises in restraint, each service a dangerous dance of avoiding touch, suppressing glances, maintaining distance that felt like physical pain. One evening, as Andre presented a particularly exquisite dessert, his hand trembled slightly, causing a drop of sauce to fall on the pristine tablecloth. Maxwell's eyes narrowed at this unprecedented slip in the chef's usually perfect service. "Perhaps," Maxwell said, his voice carrying an edge sharp as a knife, "we should consider some changes to the household staff. Fresh perspectives can be valuable." The threat hung in the air like poison gas. That night, Rose found Andre in the kitchen, his normally immaculate workspace in disarray. Plans for escape competed with fears of consequences on his troubled face. "I cannot bear to be an instrument of your captivity," he confessed, his voice raw with emotion. "Every meal I serve feels like another bar in your cage." Rose moved closer, caution forgotten in the face of his pain. "You are my only freedom," she whispered, her hand finding his face. "The only real thing in this artificial world." Their first kiss tasted of desperation and hope, of herbs from the garden and tears neither remembered shedding. It lasted mere seconds before the sound of approaching footsteps forced them apart, but its impact was seismic. They had crossed a line. In the days that followed, every glance carried the memory of that kiss. Every accidental touch sparked with dangerous electricity. The other staff could sense the shift. Something fundamental had changed, making their secret both more precious and more perilous. Anonymous notes increased in urgency. "His watching. The cameras never sleep. Be ready." Each warning carried the weight of discovery, of consequences too terrible to contemplate. Yet love, once awakened, refuses to be caged. In the herb garden at dawn, in the quiet corners of the kitchen, in the coded messages of recipes and ingredients, Rose and Andre's connection deepened beyond physical attraction into something profound and unbreakable. They knew discovery was inevitable. Maxwell's web of surveillance and control was too thorough, his suspicion too aroused. Yet like moths drawn to flame, they continued their dangerous dance, each moment stolen from fate feeling more precious for its forbidden nature. As autumn painted the estate gardens in shades of gold and crimson, Rose and Andre found themselves caught in a current pulling them toward either salvation or destruction. Their hearts, once awakened, could never return to sleep, but the price of staying awake in this gilded nightmare grew steeper with each passing day. The question was no longer if they would be discovered, but when and what price they would pay for daring to find love within the walls of their elegant prison. The autumn storm that heralded Maxwell's early return seemed to shake the very foundations of Thornfield Estate. Thunder crashed overhead as his black Mercedes pulled up the drive, hours ahead of schedule. In the kitchen, Rose and Andre froze at Luce's breathless warning, their hands still entwined over a half-completed soufflé. His reviewing the security footage, Lucy whispered, her face pale. "All of it. From the beginning." The systematic destruction of their careful world began in Maxwell's study. His aged fingers moved across the keyboard with mechanical precision, his eyes fixed on the screens before him. Hours of footage played out in damning sequence, lingering touches during meal service, whispered conversations in the herb garden, stolen kisses in supposedly blind spots. Mrs. Reynolds stood rigidly beside his desk, her face ashen as she watched their secrets unfold. "Sir, perhaps." Silence. Maxwell's voice carried the chill of winter. "Send them both to me. Separately." Andre arrived first, his chef's whites pristine, his posture straight as steel. The study, with its dark wood panels and looming portraits of Bishop ancestors, seemed to close in around him. "Explain." Maxwell gestured to a frozen frame on his monitor, Andre's hands covering Rose's as they kneaded bread dough, their faces too close for propriety. "I am resigning my position, effective immediately," Andre replied, his French accent more pronounced under stress. "My behavior has been unprofessional. I take full responsibility." Responsibility? Maxwell's laugh held no humor. "You think resignation absolves you of stealing my wife?" She is not a possession to be stolen. The words escaped before Andre could stop them, hanging in the air like a death sentence. Maxwell's facade of civilized control cracked. He rose from his desk with surprising agility for his age, crossing the space between them in 2 swift strides. You dare lecture me about my own wife? A servant? A common cook? In the hallway, Rose pressed her ear to the door, her heart pounding. The raised voices carried through the thick wood, Maxwell's cold rage, Andre's measured responses growing more heated. Everything I own is monitored, protected, secured, Maxwell spat the words. Including her. Did you think I wouldn't notice? That your little romance would go undiscovered? She deserves freedom, Andre's voice rang with conviction. The chance to live, to love, to choose. The sound of a slap cut through the air. Rose pushed through the door without thinking, entering the study just as Maxwell's hand drew back for another strike. Stop! Her voice, so often soft and compliant, cracked like a whip. Don't you dare touch him. The tableau froze, Maxwell with his hand raised, Andre with a reddening cheek, Rose trembling but defiant in the doorway. Outside, lightning illuminated the scene through tall windows, casting harsh shadows across their faces. So, Maxwell turned to his young wife. The obedient child finds her voice at last. And for what? A chef? A servant who seduced you with pretty words and French pastries. He showed me kindness, Rose's voice grew stronger. He saw me as a person, not a possession. Not another piece in your collection. The study had acquired an audience. Staff members clustered in the hallway, drawn by the confrontation. Lucy clutched Mrs. Reynolds' arm, watching the scene unfold with horror and fascination. Kindness. Maxwell's laugh was brutal. I gave you everything. This house, these clothes, your very future. Without me, you're nothing. Your family would be destitute. Is that what you want? I want to live, Rose's words carried years of suppressed emotion. Not exist as your perfect porcelain doll. I'm leaving, with or without your permission. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the storm seemed to hold its breath. Leaving? Maxwell's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. My dear, foolish child. You seem to have forgotten our arrangement. He moved to his desk, pressing a button on his intercom. Security team to the study. Immediately, Andre stepped forward, placing himself between Rose and Maxwell. She's not your prisoner. No, Maxwell agreed, his composure returning like ice reforming over dark water. She's my wife. And you are an employee who has grossly overstepped his position. He addressed the security team entering the room. Remove Mr. Laurent from the premises. Ensure he takes nothing but his personal belongings. Mrs. Bishop will be confined to her quarters until further notice. The next moments dissolved into chaos. Rose screamed as security guards grabbed Andre's arms. He fought briefly before catching her eye, communicating volumes in a single look. Not like this. Not yet. This isn't over, Rose promised as another guard led her away, her voice carrying down the corridor. You can't keep me here forever. Can't I? Maxwell's question floated after her, soft as silk and sharp as a blade. The staff scattered as Andre was marched through the house, his head held high despite the grip on his arms. In the kitchen, his sacred domain, he was allowed 5 minutes to collect his knives, his most precious possessions. Lucy slipped him a folded paper as he passed, tears streaming down her face. Rose watched from her window as Andre was escorted to the gates, the rain soaking his white uniform. Their eyes met across the distance, and she pressed her hand to the glass. He raised his hand in return before disappearing into the storm. In the following hours, Maxwell's revenge was swift and thorough. Rose's quarters were locked from the outside. Her phone and tablet disappeared. Even her window was fitted with elegant but unbreakable bars. For her safety, Maxwell explained to concerned staff members. But he had underestimated the loyalty Andre had inspired in certain staff members. Lucy managed to smuggle notes between them, written in the language of recipes they had shared. Mrs. Reynolds, despite her initial disapproval, found her conscience weighing heavier than her loyalty. 3 days after Andre's dismissal, Rose read his final message, midnight. Kitchen garden. Be ready. The escape attempt was both desperate and doomed. Rose had almost reached the garden when security lights flooded the grounds. Maxwell's voice cut through the night air, amplified by the estate's speaker system. "Did you really think I wouldn't be watching?" His words dripped with cruel amusement. "That I wouldn't protect what's mine." Rose ran anyway, her bare feet silent on the wet grass. Andre waited by the garden gate, his familiar silhouette a beacon in the darkness. Their fingers had just brushed when the guards appeared, separating them with professional efficiency. "Take him." Maxwell emerged from the shadows, his face terrible in the harsh security lights. "Call the police. Report him for trespassing, breaking and entering, attempted kidnapping. Whatever charges will stick." "No!" Rose fought against the hands holding her. "This has to end. You can't keep me prisoner forever." Maxwell stepped close, his voice meant for her ears alone. "My dear, this is only the beginning. You'll learn what real imprisonment means." As Andre was dragged away for the second time, the look that passed between him and Rose carried equal measures of love and desperation. They both knew that Maxwell's patience was at an end, that his carefully maintained veneer of civility had cracked beyond repair. In the distance, police sirens wailed. The storm had returned, rain mixing with Rose's tears as she was led back to her gilded cage. Behind her, Maxwell's voice carried on the wind. "Prepare my study. There are arrangements to be made." The night wrapped around Thornfield Estate like a shroud, lightning illuminating scenes of barely contained violence. In the kitchen, Lucy gathered broken glass with trembling hands. In the security office, guards reviewed footage with military precision. And in her locked room, Rose stood at her barred window, watching the garden where herbs still grew, carrying memories of love and whispered promises of freedom. The air felt charged with more than electricity. Tomorrow would bring either salvation or destruction. For now, the estate held its breath, waiting for the next act in this tragedy to begin. The engraved invitations arrived at dawn, hand-delivered to Riverton's most prominent families. Maxwell Bishop requested the pleasure of their company for an intimate dinner party celebrating his young wife's newfound passion for French cuisine. The cruel irony of the theme wasn't lost on the household staff as they watched Rose receive her own invitation at breakfast, delivered like a death sentence on a silver tray. "Your presence is required," Maxwell announced, watching her read the card. "Andre will be preparing the meal. Consider it his final performance at Thornfield Estate." Rose's teacup clattered against its saucer. "You can't force him to come back." "My dear," Maxwell's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I already have." Amazing what people will do when faced with certain legal complications. He arrives this afternoon to begin preparations. The kitchen, once a sanctuary, transformed into a battleground. Andre returned under armed guard, his usual pristine whites replaced by a borrowed uniform. His hands, usually so confident with his knives, trembled slightly as he reviewed the elaborate menu Maxwell had selected. Lucy managed to slip Rose a note during her afternoon dress fitting. "Something's wrong. He's planning something terrible. Be careful." The warning hardly seemed necessary. Every staff member could feel the wrongness in the air, the sense of approaching tragedy. Mrs. Reynolds discovered her access to the wine cellar had been revoked. The new security team positioned guards at every entrance. Maxwell spent hours in his study, making mysterious phone calls and reviewing camera feeds. As evening approached, Rose stood before her mirror, a vision in burgundy silk. The dress, Maxwell's choice, felt like a shroud. Through her window, she could see guests arriving, their expensive cars gleaming in the circular drive. "It's time, my dear." Maxwell appeared in her doorway, resplendent in a tailored tuxedo. His aged hand gripped her arm with surprising strength. "Shall we give them a performance to remember?" The grand dining room had been transformed. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbow light across damask tablecloths. Silver service gleamed at each place setting. In the center of the table, dark red roses dripped like blood into a crystal vase. Andre worked silently in the kitchen, preparing each course with mechanical precision under the watch of armed guards. His eyes met Rose's briefly as she was led past the kitchen doors, a look of such anguish that she nearly broke their forced charade then and there. "Ladies and gentlemen," Maxwell addressed their guests once all were seated. "Tonight, we celebrate the joining of Old World cuisine with New World passion. Our recently departed chef has graciously returned to prepare his final meal for Thornfield Estate." The first courses arrived in elegant succession. Champagne flowed. Conversation hummed. On the surface, it was a perfect evening in high society. But undercurrents of tension rippled beneath the polished veneer. Rose noticed Maxwell wasn't eating, merely pretending to taste each course. She also noticed the strange metallic taste in her wine, the way his eyes never left her as she raised each glass to her lips. In the kitchen, Andre's hands shook as he prepared her final course, a dark chocolate soufflé they had once practiced together during happier midnight lessons. Lucy hovered nearby, ostensibly polishing silver, her face pale with unspoken warning. "The piece de resistance approaches," Maxwell announced, rising to his feet. "A special dessert, prepared specifically for my beautiful young wife. A fitting end to our celebration." The word "end" hung in the air like poison. Andre appeared with the soufflé, his face a mask of despair. As he set it before Rose, a small napkin dropped into her lap. 3 words hastily scrawled. "Don't eat it." Rose's hand trembled as she lifted her spoon. Across the table, Maxwell watched with the intensity of a predator about to strike. The other guests had grown quiet, sensing but not quite understanding the drama unfolding before them. "Is something wrong, my dear?" Maxwell's voice carried a warning. "Surely you'll try your favorite chef's final creation." Time seemed to stop as Rose looked at the dessert before her, then at Andre's desperate face, and finally at her husband's cold, triumphant eyes. In that moment, every betrayal, every manipulation, every moment of controlled cruelty crystallized into perfect clarity. She stood, her chair scraping backwards with a sound like fate's fingernails on a chalkboard. "No." The single word shattered the evening's careful performance. Maxwell's facade cracked, showing the rage beneath. "Sit down." Instead, Rose picked up the soufflé and hurled it against the wall. "You thought you could kill me and make it look like suicide? Or perhaps blame Andre? Another tragic accident in your carefully controlled world." Chaos erupted. Guests scrambled from their seats as Maxwell lunged across the table. Andre vaulted over the serving station, trying to reach Rose. Security guards converged from all directions. "You're insane." Rose backed toward the kitchen, her voice carrying over the commotion. "All of it. This house, these cameras, this prison. You're completely insane." Maxwell's laughter sent chills through the room. "Insane? I protected you, gave you everything, and you threw it away for a cook." He reached for her just as she grabbed a knife from the carving station. "Stay back." The dinner guests fled in terror as Maxwell advanced. "You think you can threaten me? In my own house? Everything here belongs to me, including you." Rose's hand was steady now, the knife gleaming in the chandelier light. "I was never yours. None of us were, not your other wives, not your staff, not me. We were just prizes in your collection." Andre tried to reach her but was restrained by guards. Mrs. Reynolds stood frozen in the doorway. Lucy sobbed quietly in the corner. The air crackled with imminent violence. "Enough." Maxwell's roar echoed off crystal and silver. "I will not be defied in my own home." He lunged for the knife. Rose stepped back. Time slowed to a terrible crawl. Later, witnesses would disagree about exactly what happened next. Some said Rose had turned the knife on herself rather than remain Maxwell's prisoner. Others swore Maxwell had tried to wrench it away and lost control. A few even claimed Andre had broken free and tried to intervene. The truth died with Rose, along with dreams of freedom and midnight cooking lessons. Her burgundy dress turned a darker shade as she crumpled to the marble floor, the knife clattering beside her like an accusation. Maxwell stood in shocked silence, his perfect world shattered like the crystal that had fallen during the struggle. Andre's anguished scream echoed through the estate as police sirens wailed in the distance. In the kitchen, the herbs they had gathered together that morning still lay on the counter. Their fragrance a final reminder of love bloomed and lost in the prison of Thornfield Estate. The security cameras recorded it all, silent witnesses to the final act of a tragedy built on control, obsession, and the desperate flight of a caged bird toward freedom. Mrs. Reynolds would later tell police she had seen it coming, had watched love and fear and desperation build to this inevitable conclusion. Lucy turned over her collection of secret notes, each one documenting the path to tragedy. And Andre, interviewed in custody, spoke of a young woman who had found her strength too late, who had chosen death over a life without freedom. As dawn broke over Thornfield Estate, dew settled on the herb garden where their love had first bloomed. In the kitchen, a final batch of pain au chocolat, prepared by Andre before the fateful dinner, grew stale on the counter, a bittersweet reminder of lessons learned and love lost in the dark heart of a golden cage. Detective Angelina Morgan arrived at Thornfield Estate as the first hints of dawn crept over the horizon. Emergency lights painted the manicured grounds in alternating red and blue, reflecting off the dew-covered roses like drops of blood. The grand dining room, with its crystal chandeliers and damask tablecloths, had become a grotesque tableau, the perfect dinner party frozen at the moment it descended into tragedy. Victim is Rose Bishop, age 18, the responding officer reported, his voice tight. Pronounced at the scene. Several witnesses, including household staff and dinner guests. Mr. Bishop is in his study with his lawyer. Rose's body remained where she had fallen, her burgundy dress now stained a darker shade. The carving knife lay nearby, marked with an evidence tag. Scattered around her were the remnants of the evening's elegance, overturned chairs, broken crystal, a chocolate soufflé smeared across the expensive wallpaper. "Where's the chef?" Detective Morgan asked, noting the half-prepared dishes still sitting in the kitchen. "The one who was supposedly forced to cook tonight. Andre Laurent. Missing." The officer consulted his notes. "Left during the chaos. Security footage shows him fleeing through the garden gate. Units are searching the area." Maxwell's composure remained impeccable as he received the detective in his study. His lawyer, a sharp-faced woman in a midnight blue suit, did most of the talking. Their story was neat, practiced, tragic, a disturbed young woman, unstable from the beginning, who had finally snapped under the pressure of her position. "We have grave concerns about Mr. Laurent's influence over my client's wife," the lawyer stated smoothly. "His manipulation of a vulnerable young woman." "Save it for the press," Detective Morgan cut in. "I need the security footage. All of it." In the kitchen, forensics teams photographed every surface. Half-chopped vegetables sat abandoned on cutting boards. A batch of pastries grew stale on cooling racks. Everything looked frozen in time, as if waiting for its young apprentice chef to return and continue her lessons. Lucy, the young maid, broke first during interviews. Her hands trembled as she handed over a showbox full of evidence. Notes passed between Rose and Andre, written in the language of recipes and ingredients. Photographs snapped secretly in the garden. A final warning about the poisoned dessert. "He was going to kill her," Lucy whispered. "Mr. Bishop. I heard him in his study, planning it." The soufflé was supposed to look like suicide, or like Andre had poisoned her. But she figured it out. Mrs. Reynolds proved a more composed witness, her silver hair still perfectly coiffed despite the hour. "It was like watching a slow-motion collision," she told Detective Morgan. "The isolation, the control, the cameras everywhere." Then Andre arrived, and Rose began to wake up, to realize her cage was a prison. The security footage told its own story. Hundreds of hours of surveillance revealed the progression of Rose and Andre's relationship, from innocent cooking lessons to stolen glances, from shared moments in the garden to desperate plans for escape. The cameras that had been Maxwell's tools of control now became evidence of his escalating obsession. "Look at this," Detective Morgan's partner pointed to a screen showing Maxwell's study. Hours before the dinner party, they watched him carefully measuring powder into a small vial, then summoning Andre at gunpoint to incorporate it into the dessert. Crime scene analysts moved methodically through the dining room, collecting broken crystal, photographing blood spatter patterns, mapping the final violent confrontation. The knife told its own story, multiple sets of fingerprints, signs of a struggle, a tragic end to a desperate bid for freedom. News vans began arriving around noon, their satellite dishes rising like strange flowers from the gravel drive. The story proved irresistible: young bride, wealthy older husband, forbidden romance with the family chef, tragic end in a mansion on the hill. Headlines practically wrote themselves. Detective Morgan watched as Rose's parents arrived, their modest car looking out of place among the police vehicles and news vans. Their grief was raw, uncontained by wealth or social expectation. Rose's mother collapsed at the sight of the house, crying out for her daughter, for forgiveness, for answers that would never come. In the garden, forensics teams carefully documented the herb beds where Rose and Andre had stolen moments together. Fresh basil and thyme released their fragrance as evidence was collected, their scent mingling with the lingering tragedy in the air. "We found this," an officer handed Detective Morgan a small notebook, its pages stiff with morning dew. "Hidden in the herb garden." Inside, written in Rose's careful hand, was a diary of sorts. But instead of traditional entries, each page contained a recipe, annotated with hidden meanings. Coq auvin, Andre taught me this today. Like the wine, love can't be rushed. It must simmer slowly, drawing out deeper flavors. When he showed me how to reduce the sauce, our hands touched. I felt more in that moment than in my entire marriage. The investigation spread outward from the estate like ripples in a dark pond. Andre's apartment was found empty, clothes missing, passport gone. His car was discovered abandoned at the train station. Bank records showed a large cash withdrawal just before the dinner party. Maxwell's careful alibis began to unravel under scrutiny. Former household staff came forward with stories of controlling behavior, of other young wives who had fled in the night. Financial records revealed a pattern of buying silence, of making problems disappear. By sunset, Maxwell Bishop had been taken into custody, his expensive lawyer already crafting a defense. The dinner guest statements painted a picture of premeditated murder gone wrong, of a controlling man whose perfect world had shattered when his possession dared to love another. Crime scene technicians worked through the night, their flashlights dancing across the grounds like fireflies. In the kitchen, they found one last message scratched hastily into a cookbook margin. "My dearest R, remember what I taught you about strength. About survival. About love. Forgive me for not being able to save you." The media devoured every detail. Reporters tracked down former staff members, previous wives, anyone who could add color to the tragic story. Society columns that had once celebrated Maxwell and Rose's May-December romance now dissected every aspect of their relationship, searching for signs they had missed. Detective Morgan stood in Rose's bedroom as the first day of investigation drew to a close. The space felt hollow now, designer clothes still hanging in perfect order, a tablet displaying a schedule that would never be followed again, a window with a view of the herb garden where love had dared to grow in the shadow of control. On the bedside table, a single cookbook lay open to a recipe for pain au chocolat, the pages marked with tears. Beside it, a pressed sprig of rosemary, for remembrance, told the final chapter of a love story that had bloomed and died in the prison of Thornfield Estate. As night fell, the police lights finally dimmed, leaving the mansion in darkness. But somewhere in the distance, a fugitive chef carried the weight of love and loss with him into the unknown, while in the herb garden, the fragrant plants they had tended together continued their slow growth, indifferent to the tragedy that had unfolded among their leaves. 3 months after Rose Bishop's death, Andre Laurent walked into the Riverton police station and surrendered himself. His appearance had changed. Gone were the crisp chef's whites and professional demeanor. In their place was a man haunted by grief, carrying a heavy metal lockbox. "I should have come sooner," he told Detective Morgan, placing the box on her desk. "But I needed to make sure these would survive. Rose's real story needs to be told." Inside the box were dozens of memory cards, carefully removed from hidden cameras Andre had placed throughout the kitchen and herb garden. Not for surveillance, like Maxwell's systems, but for protection. Each card documented the slow progression of Maxwell's psychological torture, the calculated way he had isolated and controlled his young wife. "She knew I was recording," Andre explained, his voice heavy with unshed tears. "It was her idea, after she discovered his plan to poison her. She said if anything happened, the truth needed to survive." The footage proved devastating. Maxwell's careful facade of concerned husband crumbled as investigators watched him methodically planning Rose's murder, forcing Andre at gunpoint to prepare the poisoned dessert, orchestrating what was meant to appear as either a suicide or a crime of passion. "We have him," Detective Morgan said, reviewing the evidence with the district attorney. "The only question is whether to charge him with first or second-degree murder." Maxwell's arrest at his private club made headlines across the state. The sight of the wealthy businessman in handcuffs sparked a larger conversation about wealth, power, and domestic abuse. Former wives came forward, their stories forming a pattern spanning decades. The courthouse became a media circus as the trial began. Society matrons who had once coveted dinner invitations to Thornfield Estate now testified about Maxwell's controlling behavior, the way young Rose had withered under his attention. Luce's testimony about the secret notes and warnings moved several jurors to tears. Mrs. Reynolds provided years of detailed records documenting Maxwell's escalating obsession. But it was Andre's testimony that proved most compelling. She was so young, he told the hushed courtroom, but her spirit was incredible. Even in that beautiful prison, she found ways to remain herself. To grow. To love. He couldn't bear that she had found something real. Something he couldn't control. Maxwell's expensive legal team tried to paint Andre as a predator who had seduced a vulnerable young woman, but the evidence told a different story. The hidden camera footage revealed tender moments of genuine connection. Cooking lessons filled with laughter, quiet conversations in the herb garden, two people finding love despite the darkness surrounding them. Rose's parents sat through every day of the trial, their grief compounded by guilt. "We thought we were giving her a better life," her mother testified. "The money problems, the pressure. We never imagined we were sending her into a trap." The community of Riverton found itself divided. Some wealthy families closed ranks around Maxwell, arguing that Rose had betrayed her marriage vows, that Andre had overstepped his position. But others began examining their own relationships, their own power dynamics. Local domestic violence shelters reported an increase in calls, particularly from younger women in relationships with significant age gaps. Rose's story had struck a chord, forcing difficult conversations about control, coercion, and the many forms abuse can take. The jury deliberated for just 6 hours before returning their verdict. Maxwell Bishop, pillar of society and collector of beautiful things, was found guilty of first-degree murder. The judge's sentence was unequivocal. Life in prison without possibility of parole. "You created a beautiful cage," the judge said during sentencing, "and when your captive bird found her wings, you chose to kill her rather than see her fly free. There can be no mercy for such calculated cruelty." In the aftermath of the trial, Thornfield Estate was sold, its proceeds divided between Rose's family and a newly established foundation in her name. The Rose Bishop Foundation would go on to help young women escape abusive relationships, providing resources, support, and hope to others trapped in golden cages. Andre disappeared from Riverton after the trial, but his impact remained. The cookbook he and Rose had written together during their midnight lessons was found among her possessions. Published posthumously, Recipes for Freedom became more than a collection of dishes. It was a testament to love's power to bloom even in the darkest places. The herb garden where their love had grown was maintained by volunteers from the foundation. Each spring, new herbs would sprout from the earth where Rose and Andre had once stolen moments of joy. The garden became a quiet place of reflection, a reminder that love and control cannot coexist. 1 year after the verdict, Detective Morgan visited Rose's grave. Someone, likely Andre, had planted herbs around the marble headstone. Rosemary for remembrance, thyme for courage, sage for wisdom. The scents mingled in the air, carrying memories of a young woman who had dared to seek freedom, and a love that had bloomed too briefly in the shadow of control. In the visitor's log at the cemetery, a final message appeared in familiar handwriting. "My dearest Rose, the herbs grow stronger each season, just as you grew stronger in your time here. Your recipe for courage continues to inspire others to seek their freedom. Love transcends all cages. Forever, A." The tragedy at Thornfield Estate became a catalyst for change in Riverton and beyond. Domestic violence organizations used Rose's story to highlight the subtle signs of coercive control. Marriage laws were scrutinized, particularly regarding age gaps and power imbalances. The golden cage had been exposed, allowing other trapped birds to find their wings. In the end, justice for Rose came not just through Maxwell's conviction, but through the lives changed by her story. Each woman who found the strength to leave an abusive relationship, each family that recognized the warning signs, each community that established better support systems, these were her true legacy. The kitchen where she had found both love and death was eventually converted into a teaching space for the foundation. Here, women learned not just culinary skills, but independence, confidence, and the ability to recognize the difference between love and control. And somewhere, perhaps in a small French kitchen far from Thornfield Estate, a chef continued to teach others the recipes that had once given a young bride the courage to seek freedom. In the mixing of ingredients, the kneading of dough, the patient tending of herbs, Rose's spirit lived on. A reminder that true love sets free, while control destroys what it claims to protect.